why should I give to you rather than some other organization or not at all. It's not just good enough to get the one gift, but more about why should you give on an ongoing, sustainable basis.
We bristle at the idea of competition in our space, and that's another word that a lot of nonprofit leaders say, oh, well, I don't have any competition. We don't want to think about others. I don't want to create a positioning statement like that. It makes us feel like we're competing. We're all in this together. If we're truly all in this together, will you break off 10% of your budget to help a smaller charity? Will you give a fellow charity your donor prospect list? And the answer is always no.
Kevin L. Brown, welcome to the Sustainable Giving Podcast.
Thanks, Dave. Awesome to be here.
Oh, glad to have you here. You and I have gotten to know each other from a distance, thanks to the wonders of 2026 and social media, namely LinkedIn, where you are prolific, sir. And I'm just looking forward to the conversation today, not just on the socials front, but on just what's been happening in the nonprofit space.
Likewise. Yeah, it's been good to see your book floating around the same bestseller lists, and you've done well with the promotion, and yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the thing, I think we're going to find a number of things in common, but one of the things that you talk a lot about is fundability of nonprofits. And we're going to talk about that today. But really, I think the thing that I've been struck by your stuff is that you clearly are thinking not just about fundability of nonprofits, but how that looks like for the long term, and how do we include more charities in that space. And I'm sure you've got some stats you'll be able to share, but if you look at the kind of distribution of funding across the nonprofit spectrum, it is quite uneven. There's lots of metaphors we can go to there, but I really do think that this is an important conversation, and I'm glad to be able to shed a light on it. So let's start though. You originally were, as I understand it, in the kind of advertising world. So what originally pulled you from that nonprofit space into our world? What pulled you into the jungle?
Yeah, so it is interesting. The four of us co-founders of Mighty Ally, we all started in the private sector. And I think at the time, I just thought that was the path. And, I loved journalism as a kid and, studied that in college and advertising. And so, yeah, did that for a number of years, built corporate brands ranging from Apple to fintech startups to Formula One, right? It was, it was a masterclass in positioning and communications. And I just thought that's what everyone in the world knew what to do when you have an organization. And so it was actually my daughters. I have three daughters that were born into the orphan crisis, two from Uganda, one from China. And really that personal journey led us to realizing that, hey, number one, there's a lot of injustice in the world. Number two, there are a lot of nonprofits that are doing the world's most important work. But number three, they are not using the same skills around brand and communications and positioning like the private sector. So that was really the journey. I joke now I'm a corporate repenter because I can't imagine doing anything else. And we all kind of are here at Mighty Ally. And yeah, we've been at it about 9 years. And that was the jump, was how do we take this work that's been proven? And Dave, I think some people say crudely advertising is the world's oldest profession. And so, yeah, it's proven, but a lot of nonprofits, especially the small ones, are just not using these same skills. So that was the impetus. How do we take this stuff that's been proven, bring it to small nonprofits?
Yeah. Ironically, I haven't, as a guy who spent most of his career in marketing advertising, had not heard that phrase, the oldest. That makes sense.
Yeah.
What drew you to that space in the first place?
I think the psychology of it all. I mean, I thought about, studying psychology in college, and I think that was probably the personal fascination is, what makes people tick on the inside, what makes them click. I've always loved that human psychology. And I mean, we could talk about all the nuances of fundraising, but, that's really all it is thinking about how humans click and tick and appealing to humans in the way that we want to be appealed to as other humans. And for some reason in our space, we think of nonprofits here and donors there. And we think of donors as maybe this weird, invisible, mysterious bucket of, strange people, but they're just humans too. And so a lot of the same principles apply to us when we're going to the store and picking out a box of cereal.
Yeah. Was there a moment in your journey where this stopped being kind of theoretical or, nice head knowledge and became personal for you?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it briefly, but that single moment that changed my life was we were in China in the big government orphanage, becoming a family with our daughter and rows of kids, kind of like you would see on a CNN broadcast somewhere, rows and rows of babies that are in their cribs, and then they had learned not to cry essentially, which is just so
Mm.
heartbreaking. And my wife and I were actually the ones in tears, and we just kind of saw that, and that was kind of the moment where we realized, all right, we're going to do something about this. It wasn't just theory, and it wasn't just, hey, there's poverty and injustice in the world. That was the moment. I later learned the Mark Twain quote you might have heard: the two most important days of your life are the day you're born and then the day you find out why. And so for me, that was the day I realized why I was here, and we literally on the spot said we're devoting the rest of our lives to fighting this injustice. And so we're not doctors and lawyers and teachers and public health professionals like a lot of nonprofit leaders. We're communicators, we're brand builders. And so that's when we said, okay, how do we best apply our skills
Yeah.
to this crisis?
I love that. I can remember that day or those days, right, where you're like,
Yeah.
"Wait a second, you mean I can do what I'm good at
Yeah.
and what I feel like I've been made to do, but actually, like, in the service of some greater good?" And I think that's a tension. Maybe we act like it doesn't exist in the nonprofit space because, I remember the moment I realized that what I do mattered, not just because of the outcomes of what I did, but actually
Yeah.
because of using who I am, like, and my gifts. And did you know, Kevin, you can have like a full-time career helping causes do better work? Like, it's
Yeah.
crazy.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, this was also around the time where the idea of social enterprise was just coming out, and people,
Uh-huh.
Tom's was a big thing, and Blake wrote this book, whatever, about you can do good and do good, and so I think this
Yeah.
was around that time where people were realizing there doesn't have to be such a bifurcation, for lack of better words. They don't just have to be charity people over here like Mother Teresa, just giving up their lives and their prospects of you know decent living, right? It doesn't have to be this thing. And maybe that goes way back to some Puritan mindset where charity is the thing you sacrifice. And so I think, yeah, the last 20 years has certainly brought our sector forward in that sense of, yeah, we all, including big corporations that previously might have been evil, we all can do good in the world, and you can do okay in the world yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. One of the things you say, and I want to tip into this is, I think the kind of stat quote is only 1 in 1,000 nonprofits really grow beyond, and I think you refer to it as small business scale.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Ooh, why is that? That's a big question. So, yeah, that data refers to this really seminal study by the Bridgespan Group. They looked at 200,000 nonprofits over a 40-year period. And it's probably the most important study, I think, in our sector today that just doesn't get enough attention. And the reason we focus on that data point and on that study is because it's not just that, hey, this is sad, 1 in 1,000 grows. It's that Bridgespan looked at these big nonprofits, you could call them unicorns, and they tried to figure out what made them grow. You could point to a number of factors, but the biggest thing they found is that 90% of them had a single dominant funding type or category of
Yeah.
funding. And so you ask why more don't grow. I think one of the biggest challenges is, of course, it's brand, it's communications, it's maybe poor fundraising practices. But I think this idea of diversifying does help you survive early on, of course, and diversified funding maybe is the safest bet if you kind of want to remain small. But I think a lot of nonprofits try to get big and try to remain diversified. And
Mm,
Jane Liu, this fundraising expert, I quote her in my book. She says it's like trying to run 5 different business models at once. If you
yeah.
try to appeal to individual donors and high net worths and corporates and governments and foundations, no organization can run 5 business models at once. And so I think that's one reason so many stay so small is we're grasping at straws, every different type of donor. It's just impossible.
So when you talk about this, one, I need to look up this Bridgespan study. So, or if you
Yeah.
have it, send it to me and we'll put it in the show notes. But you talk about, well, number one, that sort of single kind of funding source. That's fascinating. I've got a wave report. I write this article every week, and I have one that I've been working on for a couple of years. I haven't quite figured out the right, final way to word it. But one of the things I've noticed is that a lot of the biggest charities do have a very kind of almost like uneven, myopic, like there's negative ways you can describe it. Like they're all in on this type of funding or that type of funding.
Yeah.
So, um, any more you have on that would be great. But I'm also just curious as to, what keeps organizations stuck in that kind of, and you talk about starvation cycles, like
Yeah.
what keeps an organization stuck in that starvation cycle?
Yeah, so that study, you can find it, called The Myth of Diversification. It comes from the Bridgespan Group, and, I think it's one of those, sets of data that we don't pay enough attention to, and to your question around what keeps us in this cycle, I mean, there are a few factors. I think one of the other big factors we look at and talk about, and then if you're listening to this pod, it's no shame. Most of you are doctors and lawyers and teachers and, uh, you know, global health professionals and scientists. We did a study and found that at the growth stage, most nonprofit leaders, 80%, are first time CEOs. Most started something in their 20s. Most have never been to business school or brand training. No, very few people go to school for fundraising, right? So I think that's one of the reasons that we stay small is inclined to focus on the work. We do the programs. We want the impact to speak
Mhm.
for itself, to stop and think about communications and positioning and brand. It kind of gives us the capitalistic creeps sometimes in our sector. And so I think that's one reason we stay small is we think, field of dreams, if we build it, they will come. And it's just not true. Unfortunately, some of the world's most important work is being done by some of the greatest organizations that are still unseen, unheard, and underfunded.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, what does it mean? The title of your new book is Fundable and Findable,
Yep.
which I love it. Love a good alliteration. So what does it mean for a nonprofit to be fundable and findable?
Yeah. Fundable means showing donors why you exist, what you do, where you're going, who will do it, how you'll get there, when it will be done. So you might be listening to this and think, oh, yeah, of course we know why we exist and what we do, but showing donors is the big nuance.
Mm,
That in our world is your theory of change. It's your strategic plan. We call it your brand. And that's part of your brand is being fundable. Being findable is occupying a space in the minds of your ideal funders. And then you have to routinely communicate your brand promises to them. In our world, that's called your positioning strategy and your marketing communications. Again, that's part of your brand. So
mhm,
we used to try to make people believe that you build your brand, and we used to try to convince people to care about the word brand. And again, sadly, I think in our space sometimes that word is a little bit of a four-letter word. So we just kind of switched it up, and it hit me like a ton of bricks one night. I wrote this concept of being fundable and findable, and it just took off. I posted it the next morning on LinkedIn. It kind of went viral, and we said, okay, we're on to something here. We have a different way of describing building your brand. So that's really all it is, Dave. Being fundable and findable is your brand.
hmm. Uh, which one tends to break first, fundable or findable?
Break first. Good question. I think the challenge is most people try to be findable before being fundable. In fact, as this term is taken off, it's like I love it. The book, is spreading, and all these tens of millions of impressions on LinkedIn. It's awesome. The thing that pains me though is when people say you have to be findable to be fundable. And that's not actually true. We're actually trying to say the opposite. You first have to be fundable and then worry about
Mhm,
being findable. The beauty of being fundable is that you're thinking about, again, the problem you're serving in your community. What's your mission? What's your vision? All of these elements you do before you even think about donors, because you want it to be authentically yours and true, right? You don't want to be chasing donor trends. You don't want to be building something that can be funded. You want to be building something that your community needs and that you're authentically good at. So if you do that work of being fundable first, then you worry about, how you're positioned, how you're unique, who else is doing what, how you communicate. And so I think that typically breaks is when you try to be findable.
yeah,
Sadly, we've seen examples even of, I mean, there were some high profile cases, and names will remain nameless, of, organizations that went viral and raised $20 million overnight. And then, they folded because they just weren't set up internally. They just weren't fundable. They
yep.
were findable, raised a ton of money, but then they just crashed because they weren't fundable first.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think about, and I don't know what you would say to this, but in the sort of product development world, again, back to kind of the consumer or kind of business side, it's the equivalent of having a really great ad campaign, but the product
Yeah.
itself is not great. You're like,
Yeah.
Or I do a lot with subscriptions, right? How many of us have been tricked into a subscription? I was just looking at a certain device, which again will remain nameless, on our kitchen counter that my wife bought in January, and I was like, "Okay, but does this come with a subscription?" I was like, "Of course it
Yeah.
does." And then now we're not using it, and now every time I see that device, I'm like, "They they were findable, like, they
Yeah.
got in our feeds, and, we paid money for this thing, but now I regret it because it's just like,
Yeah.
it fundamentally, it was not a good experience, it's not a good product in their word." Do
Yeah.
you see is there some similarity between that
Oh, yeah.
and really what charities are doing?
Totally, that's a perfect analogy, and making matters worse, it's like that old saying that if someone goes to a restaurant and has a good experience, they'll tell one person. If they have a bad experience, they'll tell 10 people. And that's the challenge is if you're findable, it's not just you're hurting that single donor's prospect if that quote product is not good enough. Word spreads, especially in the
Yeah,
foundation world, especially in the high net worth world, right? I mean, donors talk to other donors, and so you're not only shooting yourself in the foot for that existing immediate donation, but you're potentially just paralyzing your fundraising potential for the long term. So, yeah, there's just no reason that you should ever focus on viral campaigns and driving a bunch of money unless you have the right product, so to speak.
right. I'm curious, I don't know what your perspective is on this, but how does becoming fundable and findable impact long-term donor commitment?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, I think being fundable just builds that trust and it builds that connection. And use the word commitment. Another way to think of fundable and findable, I always use the words identity and then visibility. So identity, when someone as a donor knows why you exist and what you do and what you stand for, or your values, all that stuff that goes into being fundable. I mean, that creates some natural affinity and long-term commitment. And then yeah, being findable, I think that reassures donors, right? There's this concept that I include in the book around what the hell does donor stewardship even mean? It's just communications. We've all heard the rule of seven, ask for money, get money, and then have seven touch points before you ask again. Like that kind of stuff keeps donors around when you're actually out there communicating and when they're proud to see you and the brand out there and telling a clear story. I mean, that keeps them coming back to support more. So
Yeah,
yeah, this work isn't just about acquisition. And I talk a lot about that. It's actually just as much about retention. Yeah, it's not just
yeah,
getting an immediate donation and moving on to do more of the work. It's actually retaining those donors for the long haul.
yeah, yeah. I think about, you talk about the starvation cycle, this idea of moving to fundable and findable, which in principle I think is makes a lot of sense. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance to it. You cover that in the book, but let's make this real. Like, can you share an example of an organization that's like, hey, they were in the sort of classic starvation cycle. They were able to do something. I don't know what they did, but something to become quote unquote fundable and findable, and that moved them from that starvation cycle.
Yeah. So actually, I lead with it in the book because I love this story. It's one of our favorite case studies because it was so perfect how it began. We met this client because they had just experienced a series of fundraising failures. They had met with a high net worth donor and thought it went well. And that donor flat out told them, no, I'm not going to give you money because your brand is shit. And it was this classic UK high net worth donor that just told him flat out, your brand is shit. And so not only was that a great story, but the way that the nonprofit leader handled it was amazing. So we talk often about the dynamic between doers and donors and grant makers and grantees and how we're in it together. So it was beautiful. This nonprofit leader said, hey, why don't you put your money where your mouth is and help us make the brand better? And so I imagine he said those exact words, but he did it. He essentially told the donor, well, hey, if you don't want to support us because of the brand, will you at least give us money to improve the brand? And so the donor did. This high net worth
Huh.
paid for our engagement. That's how we met this client. And previously they were called African Prisons Project. They're now called Justice Defenders because of all the work we did with them. And yeah, we spent months. We went back to the root causes of their theory of change, and they were just doing so much. They had all these different forms of their mission where they were helping people get fair hearings in court. They were helping with reintegration after they got out of prisons in East Africa. They were doing health programs, and they just did so much that it was confusing. And so we helped narrow the story. We helped position them well. We, of course, kind of rebranded them. It culminated with a segment with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes. We raised millions of dollars. It was just such a great story because the brand worked in unison. But we did all of that upfront, really deep digging on who are they at the core? What do they do? What do they not do? And then the best part about this story, the reason I bring it up is we went on this journey to make them fundable and findable. They just were featured again on 60 Minutes, and this same high net worth that said their brand was shit ended up giving them $1.5 million and became a lifelong supporter. Not because, it was some flashy new branding, but the high net worth saw that they put in the work to define their identity and then worried about their visibility. So, yeah, favorite story. I love
Yeah.
telling it just because of all the different dynamics involved.
What are some things that leaders need to rethink if they're gonna go on this journey?
I mean, the first thing to rethink is that more fundraising can't fix your fundraising. That's one of the core tenets of what we do at Mighty Ally, and what I say in the book is if your fundraising isn't working, you can't just do more of it. I think we fool ourselves into thinking that, okay, well, if we just have some new consultants come in, or if we just hire a bigger team, or if we just get a new prospect list, maybe we can raise more money. But I always joke it's like the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and
Mhm.
expecting a different result. I think that's the first thing we need to rethink in our space is if it's not working, stop, do something differently, whether it's a subscription, sustainable giving model like you practice, or whether it's being fundable and findable. There have to be different ways to solve this problem. So, I mean, I think that's the first thing is, stopping long enough. But then also, I think a lot of the leaders we work with, we have to rethink that you as a leader, you are the chief earning officer. You are ultimately responsible for a lot of the fundraising, even if you're not doing it yourself. You can't just be focused on the products and programs. You are the ultimate brand builder. You are the ultimate storyteller. And there have been very few large nonprofits and large social change movements that have grown without an individual leader and storyteller and the thought leader at the center. So I think that's the other thing is you also have a brand. You also have a role within this fundraising journey.
Over the past few years, as we've worked with dozens of organizations to grow sustainable recurring giving, I keep hearing the same thing from leaders. They don't just want tactics, they want community. They want to know that they're not doing this alone. And for some teams, they're not quite ready for our sustainable giving deep dive accelerator, but they are ready for something more accessible, something that helps equip them, not just one person, but their whole team. That's exactly why we created Rise. Rise is a new implementation focused group advisory program designed to help organizations grow recurring giving that actually lasts. It's a place where we turn insights into action, and then action turns into momentum. Inside our Rise program, you'll get live group advisory calls, office hours with me, ongoing education and training, access to guest experts, and a private community where you can ask questions, share ideas, and learn from peers who are wrestling with the same challenges you are. You'll also have access to our advisory team, so when you're stuck, unsure, or deciding what to try next, you're not guessing alone. Here's the heart of it. You don't have to grow sustainable giving on your own. Rise is where leaders grow recurring giving together with guidance, accountability, and forward momentum. Enrollment is open now, and if this sounds like something your organization or your team needs, I would love for you to learn more or raise your hand. You can visit sustainablegiving.org/rise to explore the program or to express interest. We'd love to have you grow with us. Again, that's sustainablegiving.org/rise to sign up or let us know that you're interested. Looking forward to seeing you in the program. One of the principles I was looking through the book and one of the principles in your book, I thought, ooh, this is a hot take. Let's talk about this. Is it's okay for nonprofits to look slick.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah. Funny enough, the chapter used to be called "It's Okay for Nonprofits to Be a Little Sexy," and then different readers didn't like the word sexy as much as slick. And the idea is, Dave, that we sometimes think, oh, well, we need to look needy before people give us money. And, oh, we don't want to invest in branding because then we'll look like a big charity. And I, look, there could be a sliver of truth to that, in some ways that if you invest a ton of money in a bunch of campaigns and video assets and you have a flashy website and people see you out doing big events, they might think that you don't need them as much. But at the end of the day, it's okay to look a little slick. It's okay to look a little polished. It's okay to look like you have your act together when it comes to a visual presentation of your brand. The human mind processes images 60,000 times faster than text, they say. And so when a donor glances at your brand, that tells them a lot. And so if you look like,
Yeah.
you're not putting the time and money into kind of showcasing your work, I think people will judge the work itself. There is a little bit of a perception there, especially when some of the world's best charities do a really good job of storytelling. And even if you're a small charity, that donor might be comparing what they've seen to you. And so I think at least playing the game a little bit to show that, yeah, we're
Mhm.
serious about the work, but we're also serious about telling our story.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an interesting tension even as you're talking. I'm like, I feel this tension between I think that having a strong visual identity, brand identity, for example, really lends to credibility. Like
Yep.
I was looking at a charity's website, a couple charities websites yesterday, and I thought, oh, it's very like I didn't think of this consciously, but in our conversation, it's very kind of almost mom and pop, a little bit like,
Mm,
do they know? Like there's an implication of like, do they know what they're doing? Not
yeah.
because they don't have a, sexy logo to use that
Yeah.
term, but because there's just something it's just there's a level of professionalism that isn't there,
Yeah.
which I think does actually hurt credibility. On the other end of the spectrum, shiny, slick, right? Some of those words, I do
Yep.
wonder, right? There's two kind of potential tensions, and I'd love for you to address one or both. One is the sort of it looks like advertising, and so we ignore it. I see that a
Yeah.
lot from
Yeah.
nonprofits. Like they what they think of when they think of slick is like super awesome graphics and like,
Yeah.
every email looks like a
Yeah.
website and
Yeah.
so there's one which is and I refer to it from the olden web days of banner blindness, like where
Mhm.
it looks like an ad and our brains are just trained to like
Yep.
ignore it because it looks like an ad. So that's one potential tension. And then the other potential tension, I think, is potentially with really slick brands is they can draw down on the authenticity. Like if
Mm.
they're overly produced, instead of really showing the work or the need, they're shining it on, right?
Yep.
Like here's a sheen on all this, and it's like,
Yep.
and I think they sometimes reduce kind of the actual raw authenticity. Now, raw doesn't mean bad production quality, and I'm sure
Right.
you have some thoughts on that, but like, what are your thoughts on those kind of
Yeah.
tensions in that space?
Yeah, that's fair. I love that exploration and I love the fact that there is tension. I mean, all good communications and brand building and fundraising, there are going to be tensions. Interestingly, so at Mighty Ally, if you boiled it all down, you could consider us a brand consultancy. We're a nonprofit hybrid ourselves, and so we work with a lot of our fellow nonprofit peers. But at the end of the day, we do brand. Funny enough, we don't keep any visual designers on staff full time because it's such a small part of what we do. When we think about brand, there's this spectrum from identity and defining your mission and your vision and your values all the way through your positioning and your messaging. And then finally, what's that visual representation of it? We can outsource that all day long. There are great designers all day that can help explore that final tension. And so, yeah, it's funny enough, a small part about of what we do, and by the time you get to the visual representation, you should have developed so much of your brand that, yeah, if it's a little too shiny or if it's a little too raw, like those decisions don't matter as much as the clarity about who you are at the core and what makes you different. I think that's what's beautiful about doing this work. You can have a Squarespace website with a template. You can use free templates out of Canva or PowerPoint or Google Slides. It's less about the look and more about the substance, and that's part of your brand as well. That's part of your branding as well. So, yeah, that's what we would say is don't stress as much about the final visual representation because, to your point, if you build all those building blocks, I think the authenticity will just automatically be there no matter what it looks like.
Yeah, yeah, that's a an area certainly as somebody who's worked with a lot of charities that it's like that spectrum from do you really understand who you are? What is that sort of unique, core value proposition, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have that, that's the equivalent of not having the fundamental fundable, right,
Yep.
product. But then you also do need to articulate it in ways with words and visuals and otherwise that are then move people because we've also
Yep.
seen the really good quote unquote product, like amazing, like this nonprofit just invented a new way to slice bread, but nobody knows about it and nobody's moved to support because they haven't figured out how to then articulate that in
Yep.
in artifacts that people see and react to and click on and fill out and complete and all that kind of stuff. So man, that's a tension that for sure I think our listeners will feel.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and on that note, it's funny, I probably say this every single time I speak or join a podcast, but at least in the foundation world, the high net worth world, corporate donor world, the number one complaint we hear from our funder friends, and I sit on the board of a couple of funders, and we have a lot of funders as clients. The number one thing we hear is they just don't understand what you do. They'll get a grant
Mhm.
application. They'll even go to your website and try to do their own due diligence. And it's just the confusion of what you do. And then the second biggest complaint is, how are you different from everybody else they already fund? And so whether they're saying this or they're just thinking it, even a high net worth donor, hey, I already support a school in this area, or hey, I already have a favorite hunger charity, or whatever it is, being clear about what you do, being clear about how you're different. I mean, if every nonprofit in the world just did those 2 things, I mean, geez, that would make, yeah, half the difference just right there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we have mutual friends at the team at Next After, and one of the things
Yep.
they talk about in their value proposition, which I actually included in my book, is this answer to the question, why should I give to you rather than some other organization or not at all?
Yep.
And I only add one element to that, which is on an ongoing basis, because obviously in
Mm,
the work that we're doing with sustainable recurring giving, it's not just good enough to get the one gift, which is very
yep.
much the, North American centric kind of point of view we have in fundraising, which is like, would you give $50 and then move on,
Yeah.
but more about why should you give on an ongoing, sustainable basis.
Yep. That's fair, totally, and
Yeah.
we don't and Dave, on that note, we bristle at the idea of competition in our space, and that's another word that a lot of nonprofit leaders say, "Oh, well, I don't have any competition. We don't wanna think about others. I don't want to create a positioning statement like that. It makes us feel like we're competing. We're all in this together." And look, I'm a hippie at heart. I used to follow the fish around in college and had long hair. Like, I'm a hippie, but at the end of the day, you have competition. I always challenge
Yeah.
leaders that tell me they don't have competition. I say, okay, great. If we're truly all in this together, will you break off 10% of your budget to help a smaller charity? Will you give a fellow charity your donor prospect list? And the answer is always no. And so at the end of the day, whether you like it or not, there are others out there. There are other choices. So whether you call them peer organizations or
Sure.
competition, you have to think about that
Peer
position.
organizations competition or apathy and lack of action.
Yeah,
We just
totally.
had a couple episodes ago, we had Chirian Koshi who just published a book called Neuro Giving. And one of the things he said that I still, is still ringing in my ears. He said one of the worst things that we can hear from donors is not no, it's
Yeah,
not now.
yeah,
And I was like, oh, wait, say that again.
yeah.
One of the worst things we can hear from donors is not no, it's not now. Because for
Mm,
so much of the talk about communications and fundraising, it's like so much of it is just lack of response,
yeah,
and whether that's true apathy, in terms of the donor, or whether they just, again, were busy and didn't see it, or whether it looked like an ad and they ignored it, or, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they might, quote unquote, say not
yeah,
now, but
yep,
that's just as much competition for,
totally,
as anything.
totally.
So
Yeah,
you mentioned Mighty Ally as, you describe it as a nonprofit hybrid consultancy.
yep,
I am fascinated by that idea,
yep,
or even what that actually means. So what does that
yep.
mean?
So when we started out, our original intention was maybe a little bit naive, but we actually just wanted to be a pure nonprofit, go raise a bunch of philanthropy, and then do this work for free for the smallest charities possible. So, hey, if you're $100,000 charity in East Africa, we just want to build your brand and help you with your communications. And we were naive because most donors don't want to support intermediaries like us, right? I think most donors want to give directly to the cause or to the implementers. And so we learned quickly that just being a 501c3 nonprofit, just raising philanthropic money was not going to work. And so we decided to have a hybrid, which means two sides. We have our 501c3 charity, but then we also have an LLC. It was the second B Corp ever in Uganda. Obviously, the B Corp movement is much bigger now. And
Mhm.
so that just gives us the ability to just be more creative with our own sustainability. So if a donor wants to fund us through a grant to do the work, great. If a client wants to just pay us for services, great. We have multiple abilities to think about our own sustainability. So that's all it means to be a hybrid. The nonprofit side, again, gives us the ability to, like I was a fellow in the acumen community. They choose a bunch of nonprofit leaders, and I was able to be in community for a year with a bunch of East African fellows, and we're funded by Cartier Philanthropy, and we're able to kind of, you know, be in that community with our nonprofit peers. But at the end of the day, we can also charge for services, which I think a lot of nonprofits could potentially learn from, this idea of not just relying on grants and donations alone, but is there some sort of earned revenue? Is there some sort of income stream?
No, I thought about that. I think with the thing that I'm fascinated by, especially in the charity space, but also just as a business person, as somebody who's fascinated with other industries and sectors, is it's really about what is the economic engine that enables you to do what you do, right? What are those funding sources, essentially revenue sources that enable you to scale your impact? Because one of the things that breaks my heart, and a friend of mine who's very deep in the innovation space in the nonprofit sector said to me, this is a couple years ago, and it's still stuck with me. He said, "Dave, the innovation in the nonprofit space is great, but the innovation stops when the grant funding goes away."
Mm,
Now,
yeah.
in his particular subsector, it's like if you had the grant funding, again, you can invent a new way to slice bread, completely change people's lives, but you hadn't. But the only way that thing was funded essentially was through the grants. Well, a lot of organizations, charities, have learned that, oh, well, that was not a resilient, model. And so I'm just as interested in how do you build in sort of economic sustainability and scale. Like in the business world,
Yeah.
if you build a product, you want to build it in such a way that if it works at, 1x scale, it'll work at 10x scale and 1,000x scale and 100,000x scale. And I think charities should think more that way, because if you've created a way to save people's lives through some treatment, for example, or some program, well, probably there's 1,000x more people that you could help,
Right.
or 1,000,000x more people if you could really scale. So I think you're right on with like what are those funding models, and let's be willing to be creative.
Yeah. Totally. I think so. Going back to the study of those nonprofits that do grow beyond a small business, these unicorns, the one in a thousand Bridgman Group, in that study, they go on to talk about how they got there. And I think government sourced funding is one of the big categories, but then service fees. I mean, that is how a lot of nonprofits get big. And I know in the United States in particular, there's some really big, behemoth, multi-billion dollar nonprofit like hospitals that are actually operating more like a for-profit business. But
Right.
at the end of the day, I don't think that charging for services is always a bad thing. Like if you're dealing with an extremely poor, poverty-stricken community that literally has no ability to pay for healthcare, some of us might believe that, free healthcare is better than no healthcare. But in a lot of communities where you're doing great work, like whatever after school programs, I mean, even if it's charging a small fee, there is some, I think, economic sustainability we can bake into our model that makes our fundraising story even that much more attractive. Most donors don't want you to have to depend on them forever. They philanthropic capital should feel like a catalyst in many cases, versus like a reliance. To your point,
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense, and I do feel the tension. You mentioned that
yeah,
same study that said like this idea of like let's have lots of sources of revenue is actually potentially, I don't know if you would say sort of anti really being able to scale. So there is a tension there, but at the same time, depending on your charity, depending on the type of work you do and who you interact with, I think you really do need to understand what are the couple kind of economic engines that we can think about. And I think two far not enough often. I think two organizations think about the sort of the service fees or the revenue sort of side of like, oh, we actually create resources. We could actually fund some of the stuff we do over here by actually charging fees or selling
yep,
programs or services.
totally. Yeah, we had an example of a very early client. They still run this camp in Kentucky, and the whole purpose of the camp is bringing kids from both racially and economically disadvantaged backgrounds into the same kind of settings that a lot of other kids get to enjoy. And they just had a brilliant model. It's like the kids from, backgrounds that couldn't afford it didn't pay or paid little. And then the kids that could afford it paid full price. And then that helped offset it. And that was just one of those examples of
Yeah.
they're a nonprofit. They're doing the good work, but they're also bringing kids that can pay to the same camp. And it's better for everyone, right? Better for their economic engine, better for all the kids involved. It's one of those simple examples of, hey, you're running a camp. Don't just give it away to kids that need it. Also charge kids that can afford it. And then everyone's better off.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, so I mentioned earlier that you are pretty prolific in the socials, especially on LinkedIn. I love seeing your stuff. In fact, you just posted something recently. I thought, ooh, I'm going to ask him about that.
Thanks.
I love it's a good hook. Donors don't read what you write.
Yeah.
They skim and scan. Science proves it. And I love the example you said. You recently posted a stat that the UN, United
Yeah.
Nations, shared that they produce more than 1,000 reports a year, but most are barely read. This is them
Yep.
admitting this. And you point to an example, a principle from your book, that is get to the point to get to the donor.
Yep.
What do you mean by get to the point to get to the donor?
Yeah, I think whether you're fundraising, whether you're selling a box of cereal like we talked about earlier, most people are busy. Most people don't want to spend more time than they have to. There's an investor called Morgan Housel. He actually wrote a great book called The
Yeah.
Psychology of Money. He says that it's a universal annoyance. Nobody likes their time wasted. It's that simple. And yet, I think in our nonprofit world, sometimes we compensate by, making the grant application longer to sound smarter, or we make a big annual report to make it seem like we've done more work. And funny enough, in this same post, someone even commented that even this, idea of having a letter from the CEO at the beginning of your annual report to summarize what comes in your annual report, it's kind of a funny idea. If your annual report is short and sweet enough, you don't need a letter from the CEO at the beginning to summarize what's to come. And so, yeah, I think over and over again, that's a thing that we see with our partners, and we hear from donors is just, get to the point. Tell me why you exist, what you do, where you're going. Get me hooked. Let's start the conversation. And then fundraising should be a conversation. It should be a relationship. It shouldn't be 80-page documents to convince a donor. So I think that's our big belief. Even the idea of pitch decks. I talk about pitch decks in my book. We have a whole framework we use with our clients, but even the idea of pitching is wrong. It's really about a two-way conversation. Don't pitch at me for 15 minutes. Let's start a conversation. Get me hooked. Give me enough to succeed, and then let's talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. This is great, Kevin. Well, as you think about just the leaders that are listening to this today, if you've got a thoughtful leader that's listening and they're thinking, what's a step that I can take towards becoming more fundable and findable? Number one,
Yep.
get the book because there's a lot of principles in the book. But what would that step be?
The first step, and this just follows the framework. The first step is we use a theory of change, and sometimes that term isn't used as widely. Some people use a logic model. That's an old USAID tool. If you don't even want to call it that, just figure out your reason for being, your mission, and your vision. Those are the three biggest pieces. So that's the first step. And that's the internal stuff. You don't need a consultant. You really don't even need a book for that. And then, yeah, the idea of a strategic plan. Who's going to do it? How are you going to get there? What are your priorities? Those are the first two steps, and that's what I think makes this work feel doable. When I do keynote speeches or whatever, I tell people you can do it. I hope you're inspired to do it, and you don't need me. Buy the book, whatever, take courses, read tons of books. There's a lot of great resources out there. Just yeah, slowly by slowly, build your brand. It's not as scary as it seems. So yeah, first step is mission. Purpose, vision. That's your theory of change. Figure out where you fit in the world, how you're going to get there, and then worry about communications. Don't start by redoing your website. I have a post that says, need a new website? Don't start with your website. Need a new pitch deck? Don't start with your pitch deck. Need new messaging? Don't start with your messaging, right? Build the foundations first. The same analogy, Dave, that I give is like it's like individual soul searching. We all kind of grow up, we go through that teenager awkward phase. We have to figure out who we are at the core first. What's in our heart? Who do we want to be when we grow up? That's the deep soul searching stuff. Then you figure out what clothes you wear, how do you style your hair, which bars or restaurants you go to with friends. You don't go out and figure out the external stuff until you figure out who you are at the core.
Yeah. And I think we're all on that journey of understanding that, like who am I, right? And
Yeah,
and as we discover more and get clues, we can follow those. That's
totally.
powerful. That's
It's a
powerful.
journey for sure. That's the other reminder is nobody has it figured out. I tell leaders all the time. I just did a 3-hour workshop earlier with these tiny, tiny, tiny grassroots organizations in East Africa. And I told them, we're in this together. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation hasn't figured this out. The world's biggest NGOs haven't figured it out. I mean, there's a reason that poverty and injustice of all forms exists. Like none of us have truly figured it out yet. So it is a journey, especially brand building and fundraising. It's kind of like a science. It's not an art. You don't paint something and put it on the wall. It's a science. You test, you have hypotheses, you learn, just like our friends at Next After, right? You figure out the data, you tweak. It's a journey for sure. As much as we believe a lot of these principles are proven, a lot of it's unproven. It has to work for you.
Yeah. I'm curious just as a, related question, obviously this is the Sustainable Giving podcast. So we think a lot about sustainability and nonprofits and leadership in their quote unquote economic engine, but also specifically this recurring giving as a revenue model for lack of a better term. Have you seen anything in your sort of fundable, findable space or what you're interacting with clients around specifically how that leads to recurring giving?
Yeah, back to this idea of being findable. We need to shift. You asked about what do we need to shift as leaders? We need to shift from thinking only about that first gift, to your point, to what happens after that first gift. I think it's Kay Sprinkle Grace, prominent author and thinker in our field, that says the moment the first gift is given, that's actually the most important phase of the fundraising process. There's a lot of data that shows how much we lose in our space. I think for every $100, it takes 96 to get a new gift. I mean, there's so much data. But the thing that shocks me, Dave, is that when donors don't give again, the two big reasons are they weren't thanked and they weren't told how the gift was used. It's just remarkable. That's not rocket science. That's not, oh, we need some new big CRM tech thing. It's just communications. Even if it's a handwritten note or a phone call or a personal email, thank them and tell them how the gift was used. So yeah, I think that's the shift. Is being findable is not just about the first gift. It's ongoing
Yeah.
findability, and that leads to retention, whether it's subscription or high net worth. Yeah, constantly communicating with donors. It's like we make up these terms of cultivation and stewardship. It's just communications. That's all it is.
Yeah. Well, 2 things. One, on the one-time givers, right? Those the first gift where it is a $50 gift or a $100,000 gift or whatever. 2 words we always talk about, with organizations. Number 1, affirm. That's the
Hmm.
close the loop. Thank you.
Yep.
This is how your gift made a difference. Affirm, affirm, affirm. But
Yep.
then the other one, and this doesn't happen, it's shocking to me how little this happens in the nonprofit sector with recurring giving, is invite. Like,
Yeah.
invite them to an ongoing impact, and um, every piece of data that I've ever looked at in the sort of if you look at the half-life of the likelihood of a donor to go from a one-time donor to a recurring donor, people think, "Oh, do you get, is it after the welcome series? Is it the 6-month mark, the 12-month mark? Like,
Hmm.
when do people, quote unquote, convert, right, to
Hmm.
from one time to recurring?" And the answer in every case that I've ever looked at is within the first 30 days.
Hmm.
And that can feel like a contradiction to the whole effort, like well, but we got to
Yeah.
close the loop. We have to thank them. I'm like,
Yeah.
yes, but thank them right away and then
Yep.
send them a nice note and then, do a thank you call or whatever your affirm kind of element is. But the next piece that's missing is the invitation.
Yep.
And it's like, well, no, recurring giving is important to us. It's like, but do your donors know that? Like, do you
Yeah.
actually invite them into that? And so,
Yeah.
um, in fact, because you talk about that first gift, with the case of recurring giving, the reality is that 97% of the value of a recurring donor takes place after the first gift.
Hmm. Yep.
Now, I haven't done the same percentage for a single gift. It's going to be a lower percentage, but the reality is, to your point, the vast majority of the value is post first gift. So, what are we doing? How are we, getting that quote unquote first gift in the first place? But
Yep.
what are we doing to really affirm and engage and invite our donors?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's so true. And that's the easy stuff, right? Again, there's so much that's unproven. Which message, which type of donor, but once someone gives, communicate with them. That's the stuff that should be shooting fish in a barrel.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Kevin, I just appreciate you and your investment in this community and just your own story, right? Of
Thanks.
figuring out, who am I, right? And then how do I fit into this world? And just a unique combination of this, sort of business savvy brand, advertising background, but also this heart for impact and especially those nonprofits that are caught in that starvation cycle, your own personal story, you and your wife, and adoption, and just being world citizens is inspiring. And I'm glad that
Thanks.
you're directing some of those efforts towards the philanthropic sector.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dave. And likewise, yeah, we're all in this together. That's the The other thing I maybe would say before we wrap up is, we talk to leaders that feel lonely, right? Nonprofit leadership, especially if you're a single founder, it can be lonely, but the truth is we're all in this together. There's so many resources, so many people that are doing the world's best work. And so this should feel like a community. It shouldn't feel like we're out on an island. So yeah, if you're out there listening to this and feel like you're stuck, feel like you're on an island, I promise you there's someone to help, and reach out to me if I can help, reach out to Dave. There's
Yeah.
a lot of good people that can help get you unstuck.
Well, before we wrap, where can people find you? Where can they find the book if they're looking for that?
Thanks. Yeah. Findable.org is the book. Otherwise, find me on LinkedIn, Kevin L. Brown. I also have a Substack newsletter. So the book is part of our own nonprofit mission. And then I write on LinkedIn, and I have a Friday Substack that's also part of our nonprofit mission. So sign up for the newsletter, follow me on LinkedIn. But yeah, buy the book if it will help, and get in touch if you need anything else.
It's awesome. Last question. What gives you hope about the future of generosity?
Ooh, it's funny. I think these days there are days that it's harder to have hope. But I think the truth is, the reason that we do this work at Mighty Ally is it goes back to this Nelson Mandela quote. He says, "As long as gross inequality and poverty exist in this world, none of us can truly rest." And to me, that gives me hope. There are a lot of leaders that are just unwilling to accept, right? Even when it just feels like politicians or big forces are bringing us down. It feels like there are something like 10 million nonprofits in the world, with how many ever tens of millions of people working in this space. And I think that gives me hope, is that there are a lot of us that won't rest, right? Um, Dr. Paul Farmer called it the long defeat. Who knows if we'll win or not, but we have to fight. And so I think that's what gives me hope, is there are a whole lot of people fighting to make the world better. And as long as we keep fighting, that's all we can do.
Yeah. 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 Well, Kevin, again, thank you for joining the show. I hope for our listeners that they've been challenged and are thinking a little bit differently, and just appreciate you, sir.
Likewise. Thank you, Dave. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Sustainable Giving Podcast. I hope you found the information helpful and that you're able to walk away with insights that you can use to start building a steady stream of recurring revenue for your organization. For even more resources to help you build a thriving recurring giving program, go online to sustainablegiving.org. That's sustainablegiving.org. And lastly, if a leader comes to mind that you think would benefit from this episode, would you do me a favor? Would you share this episode with them? Just that little act could be the difference they need to start growing sustainable recurring giving for their own organization. Until next time, thanks for joining us.